It is a particular pleasure and honor to be invited to speak on the occasion of your Foundation Day. However, I must admit, I seriously questioned whether I qualify for this distinction. Journalists are questioners, not thinkers. And I know from experience that it is far easier to ask, it's much more difficult to answer. So I truly wonder what you're going to think of what I have to say. Now, I'm not sure what you make of Indian television news and the role it has come to play in our lives today. 20 years ago, television was a very different animal to the beast it's become. But I instinctively feel that you might share the questions and issues I wish to raise, and even if you don't agree with the answers I have to offer, I suspect you might still feel that they're worth listening to. It's in that spirit that I approach the subject I've chosen for this evening, a critique of television news. I want to talk about what is a significant development on the Indian media landscape as well as its limitations, the explosion of news on television. Just over 2 decades ago, TV news was a government monopoly. We were all captive audiences of Doordarshan. Today, in contrast, there are 400 dedicated news channels, while several have their news bulletins in their daily schedules. And I'm not even counting in that number BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Channel News Asia. They would be there regardless of the Indian news miracle. As a result, it's not an exaggeration to say that news on television has today become a popular program. Even if the viewership at any one point of time does not suggest that, two other factors definitely do: the enthusiasm of broadcasters for news and the willingness of advertisers to support it. One consequence of this is that we are today a better informed nation, or at least we have the potential to be. I accept that all depends upon what you watch, but the very profusion of news and the easy accessibility of news raises questions that we have not asked before. Some of these questions might seem heretical coming from a television news producer. Others point towards debates and solutions the West has encountered, but which we in India have yet to experience. But in either case, they are questions that have to be asked. And today, I want to raise some of them, and I also would like to suggest hesitant answers. Let me start by asking, what sort of news do we get from television? It's pretty much immediate. We no longer have to wait for tomorrow's papers to find out what happened today. Television news channels can tell you within a minute. Some boast of even doing it faster. News on television can be visual and highly illustrative. Television shows rather than describes, and as a result, you feel as if you're there witnessing for yourself. Although I don't wish to exaggerate, in that sense, television news is participatory. But television news has two distinct limitations, and beyond that, it has an inherent tendency to sensationalize. Let's tackle the latter first. The screen shows only what the camera films. In turn, the camera films only what the cameraman focuses upon. This is not merely a subjective choice, although it is that too. It's also a technical matter. The camera will film the visual it focuses on, excluding what is on either side of it. You do not get the picture the eye can see, you only get what the lens can fit in. Thus, a succession of close-ups of a fire, or of dead bodies, or of trees that have fallen can suggest a blaze that is perhaps enormous, a massacre of people that is huge, or severe cyclonic destruction. It may be that that is the case, but it's also possible it may not be. In either event, the mind will leap to the conclusion, and that conclusion could often be the wrong one. This is what I mean when I say that television has an inherent tendency to sensationalize. This is also why the first statement that many people make, it has to be true because I saw it on TV, is actually misleading, or at least it's based on a fallacious understanding of TV. Now, this problem can be easily taken care of either by pulling out, widening the frame, and showing what else is around it, or by putting things in perspective with clever, well-written commentary. News on television can be visual and highly illustrative. Television shows rather than describes, and as a result, you feel as if you're there witnessing for yourself. Although I don't wish to exaggerate, in that sense, television news is participatory. But television news has two distinct limitations, and beyond that, it has an inherent tendency to sensationalize. Let's tackle the latter first. The screen shows only what the camera films. In turn, the camera films only what the cameraman focuses upon. This is not merely a subjective choice, although it is that too. It's also a technical matter. The camera will film the visual it focuses on, excluding what is on either side of it. You do not get the picture the eye can see, you only get what the lens can fit in. Thus, a succession of close-ups of a fire, or of dead bodies, or of trees that have fallen can suggest a blaze that is perhaps enormous, a massacre of people that is huge, or severe cyclonic destruction. It may be that that is the case, but it's also possible it may not be. In either event, the mind will leap to the conclusion, and that conclusion could often be the wrong one. This is what I mean when I say that television has an inherent tendency to sensationalize. This is also why the first statement that many people make, it has to be true because I saw it on TV, is actually misleading, or at least it's based on a fallacious understanding of TV. Now, this problem can be easily taken care of either by pulling out, widening the frame, and showing what else is around it, or by putting things in perspective with clever, well-written commentary. The problem is, when journalists are up against time deadlines, and that is usually the case, such balancing gets squeezed out. Now, these two limitations on television are more difficult to tackle, and in India, at least, I have seen very little attempt to tackle them. At times, there is even very little acknowledgement of them. The first limitation is that TV has problems handling what it cannot show. An anchor's head talking is not easy to follow. Oral information, the information you take in from your ears, is the most difficult way of comprehending things, particularly when they are detailed. And graphics and photographs on the screen don't always help. This is why news bulletins ignore what they cannot film. In a Western democracy where the reach of TV cameras is enormous, this has minimal impact. In India, where the reach of TV cameras is a lot less, the impact can be enormous. This is why there is so much more news in the papers than there is in a television bulletin. Until social media came to our rescue, we could hear or read about lynchings, but we never saw them. Not so long ago, when the ABVP would ban jeans in Lucknow, it would be an item in a newspaper, but very rarely on television. Why? Because there was nothing to show. More importantly, this is why the budget is so boring to watch on TV. First of all, it's just a speech. But then there's the question, what is this speech about? And that's an even bigger problem. What it's about is not the price of commodities. It's about not even the tax on the price of commodities. It's about the change in the tax on the price of commodities, and sometimes the percentage change in the tax. None of that is easy to visualize, and therefore, on TV instead, you're shown potatoes and tomatoes. No wonder, when you watch on television, most people fall asleep watching the budget. The second limitation of TV news is perhaps in a sense even more serious than the first. It has, to quote a phrase, been made famous in Britain by a man who went on to become Director General of the BBC, John Birt, in the 1970s. He said, TV has a bias against understanding. And let me explain by using a contentious Desi example, one that's very close to you here in Orissa. When television tells you about a gruesome event, like the murder of Graham Staines, it brings home the horror of what happened as no other medium can do. It sickens you, it tugs at your emotions, it stabs at your conscience, and all of that is a very welcome response. But what television does not do is to explain why this happened. I don't mean who did it, where, when, and at what time. Those are facts that can be easily communicated. I mean, why? How could followers of one of the world's most peaceful religions turn upon a single man and his 2 children? How could we, a people who consider ourselves tolerant, welcoming, loving, kill so ruthlessly and mercilessly? Now, these are questions of context, of background, of history. In the Graham Staines case, they were answered, if at all they were, by a judicial commission. No doubt newspapers equally don't tackle them effectively, although in the op-ed pages they try to do. But then newspapers don't have the same impact as a report on television about a tragedy. Television, when it reports tragedies, has a huge impact. The problem is, without the context, that impact pushes people towards easy conclusions. It pushes them to judgment. It creates in them a desire to come to a conclusion, to a judgment, which may not be the correct one, because television hasn't fully explained the context. It's given them a partial idea, and that is why John Birt said that the second limitation of television is that it has a bias against understanding. Now, 2 consequences stand out from all of this. We all think we know the truth behind Graham Staines' horrible death, and the guilty party feels hard done by. But the truth is embedded in a context the news did not and could not explore, and therefore it's a truth we have not fully found out about. The guilty party may well be guilty, but we have not fully understood from television what that guilt is. Let me at this point sum up what I've been trying to say. An inadequate appreciation of the limitations of television and an inadequate appreciation of television's inherent tendency to sensationalize, coupled with the fact that news on television is both more frequent and more accessible and often has a greater impact, can lead to unintended distortions, and it can lead to an imperfect understanding of what you're being told. In such circumstances, news and views, which should always be separate and distinct, can instead become perilously, dangerously mixed up. Now, so far, I've spoken about problems that are intrinsic to what I call the nature of television. Alas, in India, we also have several problems that are a direct result of how we use the medium. I want to turn to those now. As someone who has spent over 35 years in television, I'm particularly worried and perturbed by 4 trends that I've repeatedly noticed in the last few years. I feel a moral compunction to speak out, because not to do so would be to let down the profession I love. First, there's the way anchors choose to interview the Prime Minister. It's done with obvious deference, which leaves little opportunity to challenge and even less to cross-examine the man. Instead of focusing on a few well-researched subjects which are then pursued with diligence, each question changes the issue. There's no follow-up, and consequently, a multitude of subjects is raised without any meaningful achievement on any of them. Equally importantly, the Prime Minister is permitted to answer at exorbitant length, often rambling, frequently changing the subject, and always getting away with it. Even Donald Trump is not interviewed in this way. Worse still is the character of the questions. Not only are awkward questions avoided, but the questions are delicately, gingerly phrased and gently asked. Instead of bringing up lapses or misjudgments, the Prime Minister is instead asked to hold forth on the opposition's alleged errors. At no point is he questioned about the things that have gone wrong under his charge, and the net result is the interview lacks rigor. It feels like an easy ride, and frankly, the interview is the same whether you watch it on CNN, News 18, Times Now, or Z. And to my mind, that sort of questioning of a Prime Minister in a democracy lets down the democracy. It betrays the journalism. It does no service to the profession I love. A second concern I have about the way television functions today is the way anchors behave during television discussions. The guests who represent their viewpoints and with whom they agree are treated gently, they are permitted to speak frequently and at whatever length they want. But if the guest has an opinion that is contrary to the anchors, that guest is treated like a criminal. He or she is treated like a guilty person in the dock. And you must have seen these discussions. Voices rise, language loses all restraint, and questions are fired at the man like bullets relentlessly. The tone is accusatory, and a deliberate attempt is made to shame the person. He or she is frequently interrupted. Indeed, they're given little chance to answer one question before the next is literally hurled at them. And that is to treat the guest like a guilty party doing penance rather than doing you the favor of agreeing to participate. Even the grammar, the politeness is switched and got wrong. And yet, if you think about it, the object of a discussion is to give the audience a chance to hear different viewpoints articulated by different voices. The aim is to explore artfully, even forensically, and leave the audience both enriched, but also, very importantly, able to judge for itself. Where fair and even-handed treatment is required, the anchor instead takes sides, and each time he does so, the anchor only exposes his own prejudice. And that can only diminish the anchor. You don't want to know what Karan, Thapar, Rajdeep Desai, or Arnab Goswami think. That's not important. You want to know what the guests in the studio think. And you want to know that through intelligent and full questioning, where the guests are given opportunity to answer without being interrupted, but obviously without waffling, so that you at the end can compare the different views. But that's not what an Indian television discussion allows you to do. Instead, you get the prejudice of the anchor, and you barely hear the guests. What you get is heat rather than light. And to be honest, you see this sort of discussion most often, I know, on Republic TV and Times now, but there are younger anchors on other channels who have also, unfortunately, fallen prey to this practice. Presumably, they think it either wins audiences or it will win them cheap popularity. Now, my third concern about the way television functions today is best reflected by NDTV, because it seems to me to be the only English news channel with a credible primetime evening news broadcast. NDTV should be very flattered that you agree, and I'm delighted that we share the same high opinion of the channel. But forgive me, I'm about, at least in one respect, to deflate it. Frequently, after a story on the news bulletin on NDTV, the newsreader feels a terrible urge to tell the viewer what to think about the story that's just gone and how to judge the content of the story. Now, the anchor's remarks may be pithy, but they're still editorializing. The newspaper equivalent of what you're seeing on an NDTV bulletin would be if the editor were to put a comment at the end of every story on the front page telling you, the reader, what to think of the story you've just read. It would be unacceptable in a newspaper, and it is equally unacceptable at the middle of a news bulletin to be told by the anchor what to think about the story. I can just about understand a news anchor saying at the end of a story, that was a very sad story, which presumably it is. But for a news anchor to say at the end of a story, I had no idea such horrible people exist, right? How could someone do that sort of thing? That is putting her or his own opinion into your head, editorializing the content that you've just been shown, telling you what to think of it, directing you in a particular way, and it is unacceptable. And I'll tell you why. Because it breaches the sanctity of news. The viewer should be told what's happened, not how to judge or what to make of it. The latter is an intrusion of the newsreader's personal viewpoint, which is always unnecessary and frequently unwelcome. Worse, it treats viewers like children. It's therefore also demeaning. I will judge for myself what I think of a story. I have the mental capacity to do so. All of us will judge for ourselves. All of us have the mental capacity to do so. We do not need an anchor after an element of a news story to say how terrible, how sad, how dreadful, because that's telling us where to think. The grotesquely nationalist hashtags on TV are the fourth big concern I have. You must have seen them frequently. They're there practically every day. TV channels concoct these to push a story or to gather a response. And these hashtags reek of cheap, false, manufactured patriotism. And they're really like drum beats when you go into a jungle with a drum beater trying to gather the lion or the tiger. That's exactly what they are. They are drum beats telling you, the viewer, how to think, what to do, how to respond. Once again, they deny us the opportunity to think for ourselves. Instead, they seek to command our thoughts and command our sentiments. And just look at these. These hashtags are so artless, so crude, they're actually an affront to intelligence. Fight for India, love my flag, proud Indian, terror state Pakistan, anti-national JNU. You know, children of 10, if they were intelligent, would be ashamed of coining these phrases. There's nothing clever about them. They appeal to the crudest side of the least intelligent of us, and none of us, absolutely none of us, wants to be treated in that way. Often when I make these arguments and I point to these four particular concerns about television, I'm told that this is an illustration, this is the way New Age journalism functions. That's the explanation for these four things. And I say to you today, that carries no conviction with me whatsoever. I may be quite visibly old-fashioned, but even if how a story is presented alters with time and technology, the quest for truth, which is at the very heart of journalism, is unchanging. No matter how it's delivered, good journalism will always stand out. Bad journalism, on the other hand, cannot be disguised, leave aside forgiven, by using self-serving excuses like it reflects the mood of the party or it reflects the atmosphere of our time. Those are excuses and cover-ups for bad journalism. And certainly, no attempt to make journalism popular justifies lowering the standards of objectivity and fair play. Unfortunately, this is more than just true about news channels. It's actually a point that goes much further. It affects the very nature of the democracy we cherish in India. And therefore, it's about us, and it's about how we, as citizens, receive unvarnished truth. If we tolerate half-truths and misrepresentation, we have only ourselves to blame. And many of the people I know, I'm sure you share that, believe that the media frequently tolerates half-truths and misrepresentation, and often what you get on TV or read in the papers is not the full truth. And this brings me to the question, what would the great people of Indian journalism, the Frank Moraeses, the Girilal Jains, the Prem Bhatiyas, the George Vargheses and the Kuldeep Nayars, have made of Indian journalism today? Would they applaud their successors? Or would they cringe with despair? Would they feel that the flower of journalism has brightened and blossomed? Or would they sense that it's starting to shrivel and maybe even to rot? And I think the answer to that question lies in two great changes that have occurred since the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which were the decades when Moraes, Jain, Bhatia, Varghese, and Nair were the doyens of journalism. First, the reputation the media once enjoyed for reliability, for balance, for accuracy, has suffered. Today, you often hear the put down, just because it's in a newspaper or on television doesn't mean it's true. Social media may have spawned fake news, but the fact people rely on Twitter or WhatsApp to find out what's happened suggests they no longer trust a paper or a news channel to tell them the truth or the full story. Connected to this is the claim the media could once make of being objective and fair. Few people are prepared to believe that claim today. Without double-checking or giving a person a right to reply, and often without even knowing the full story, the media judges people and finds them at fault. I don't deny there are occasions when we're wrong. And when we are, what is it that we're doing? We are condemning an innocent person and leaving him or her with little opportunity to correct the prejudiced image we've created. That has to be fundamentally wrong. And if Indian journalism, whether on print or on television, tends to do that, it cannot be forgiven. Journalists have a sacred duty to ensure accuracy, representation, balance. And if they fail and they produce a prejudicial outcome, then they are not just letting down the profession of journalism, they're endangering Indian democracy, and worst of all, they are misleading people. And the sad truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that whatever you may make of the promise of Achhe Din, these are not good times for the Indian media. Most people I know have formed an irrevocable impression that the Indian media has become cowardly. Where once newspapers and television channels boasted of challenging and exposing the government, we now flinch from doing so. Worse, when our voices are raised, it's against the government's opponents and critics, not against the government. We criticize those who criticize the Prime Minister. We criticize those who criticize the Army Chief. We don't criticize the Prime Minister. We don't criticize the Army Chief. And you know the sad conclusion I come to? Instead of watchdogs that should growl at the authorities, even if occasionally mistakenly, the media behaves like guard dogs who seek to protect them, or pet dogs who want to be liked. And the saddest part of all of this is that it's the electronic media of which I am a part, which is widely thought to be the most to blame. Whether it's our interviews of the Prime Minister, where we refuse to challenge and sometimes even to seriously question him, whether it's our panel discussions, where volume and heat is deliberately preferred to substance and light, or the crude hashtags we deploy on the screen to dragoon and marshal people in a particular direction, each time, the net result is we fail to speak truth to power, but also we treat viewers like dumb animals who cannot see through our tricks and who will not demand better. We've even reached the stage where the Chief Justice of India in open court has had to admonish the electronic media, and instead of standing up in our defense, newspaper editorials agreed with him. This is what the Business Standard had to say last year. And I'm quoting, "There is little doubt that the abandonment of fact-checking and of even a pretense to fairness by the electronic media have put into jeopardy not just freedom of speech, but also the smooth working of democracy itself." Now, of course, television as we know it today did not exist when Moraes, Jain, Varghese, Bhatia and Nair presided over Badshah Zafar Marg. In their time, Doordarshan was the plaything of our rulers, and it was rightly reviled. Today, as I said, we have nearly 400 independent news channels, and Bhatia, Nair, Varghese would be flabbergasted at the number. But if they were to ask a simple question, I wonder how many channels would stand up to that critical test. And this is the question. Is there a channel India can be truly proud of, just as the British are justifiably proud of the BBC or the Americans of CNN? I'm not sure what their answer would be, and I'm scared to find out yours. But let me share mine. There are some channels I am proud of some of the time. Some programs I am proud of most of the times. But there are also a few channels and programs that make me cringe all the time. Whilst there are newspapers that I would unreservedly applaud, I'm afraid there isn't a single channel I can say that of without biting my tongue, because I know I would be lying. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is not the hopeless situation it might seem. After all, the media changes every single day. Each edition of a newspaper, each bulletin of a news channel is a chance to begin afresh. A new reporter, a different anchor, a better editor, and everything could change very quickly. Perhaps more than any other profession, journalism can draw hope from the fact Tomorrow is another day. So, what is the solution? I promised hesitant answers, and hesitantly and briefly, I shall attempt them. The first lesson is that reportage, simply reporting, is not enough. We need more context, more explanation, more background. In turn, that means we need more specialist correspondence, that is to say, correspondence with a dedicated understanding of the subject they are following, rather than generalists or firefighters. It also means that for most important developments, television news needs to supplement reports of what's happened with analysis of why and what it means. In other words, news analysis has to become part of news reportage. But I want to make one distinction. News analysis is not opinion. There is a big difference between analyzing intelligently, logically, balanced, and truthfully, and passing an individual opinion. The second lesson is that we also need more current affairs. News on its own is not enough. We need programs that go deeper, wider, further. I know that in India, at least in theory, we have them, but they fail to serve their purpose. And I include mine in that judgment unreservedly. Such programs work where they take their subject more seriously than they take the personalities participating in them. In India, unfortunately, it's the other way around. What we need is the cold analysis of current affairs. What we have instead is the spectacle and tamasha of clashing viewpoints. We need to shed light. Instead, we end up generating heat. Finally, television needs the sort of wisdom that comes with age. It has in plenty enthusiasm, dedication, tireless striving, and ceaseless vigil. All of that is remarkable in an industry so young. I don't want that to be misunderstood. But what television does not have is the capacity to reflect, to pronounce wisely, to be sagacious, to speak with gravitas. No doubt such qualities are difficult to acquire, but their absence is telling. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I said I would speak hesitantly. I said I would only raise a few answers, and I think I've done that. My intention was to focus attention and hopefully start a debate both about the limitations of television in terms of its nature, in terms of its tendency to sensationalize, but also about the way we in India are practicing television. I think for that purpose, I've said enough. Thank you very much for listening to me.